Greetings and salutations. Today we will be covering the case of the Grimes sisters' double homicide, which occurred on December 28, 1956. Barbara, age 15, and Patricia Grimes, age 12, were 2 out of 7 siblings who disappeared and were eventually victims of a double homicide that occurred in Chicago, Illinois. The murder of the Grimes sisters has been referred to as a crime that shattered the innocence of Chicago. The Grimes sisters were students at Kelly High School and St. Maurice, respectively. When they left their house, they were on their way to Brighton Theater to watch the new Elvis Presley movie. They went to watch Love Me Tender on December 28, 1956. The theater was in the midst of the Brighton Park neighborhood. This was an estimated 1.5 miles from their home. They supposedly had with them $2.15. However, it is unknown how they arrived at the theater. It must be noted that Barbara had been instructed to keep 50 cents of this money in a zipper in case the sisters had decided to partake in a second viewing of the film. The sisters had been seen in the concession stand line at around 9:30 p.m. after the first showing of the film. The second show was scheduled to end at 11 p.m. Taking this into account, they had been expected back home sometime around 11:45 p.m. At 2:15 a.m., the sisters had been reporting missing by their mother. Eventually, a schoolmate of Patricia's named Dorothy Weinert would inform investigators that she had been seated behind the Grimes girls, along with her own younger sister, during the film. However, Dorothy and her sister would go on to state that they left the theater at the intermission of the double feature that night, approximately at 9:30 p.m. As they were leaving, Dorothy states that she had seen the Grimes sisters standing to purchase popcorn at the concession stand line, and the two observed that they had been seemingly in good spirits and that nothing was out of the ordinary. Both Grimes sisters were staying to view the second screening of Love Me Tender, which meant that they would be expected to return home at approximately 11:45 p.m. Seeing as how the girls had not arrived home by midnight, their mother, Loretta, would go on to send their oldest sister, Teresa, at that time aged 17, along with their brother, Joey, aged 14, to the closest bus stop near their home to wait for their sister's arrival. After 3 consecutive buses had passed without either girl disembarking, both siblings returned home with the news, having by this stage already been unsuccessful contacting the girls' friends in hopes that her daughters might have been in one of their homes, along with the unsuccessful retrieval by the brother-sister pair, caused the matriarch to contact the police department and file a missing persons report with the Chicago Police Department at 2:15 a.m. on December 29th. Their disappearance launched one of the most wide-reaching missing persons hunt in Chicago's history. Quickly, a citywide search for the girls was organized. The undertaking involved hundreds of police officers who would subsequently be assigned to the case full-time. Police officers from Cook County would be assisted by colleagues from surrounding precincts, along with a task force which was devoted exclusively to locating the Grimes sisters. This task force organized volunteers to do a ground search. While this happened, police themselves would take on a door-to-door approach to the search. The initial search would focus and spread out throughout the Brighton Park area, along with the dredging of canals and rivers. In these efforts, more than 15,000 flyers would be handed out to locals in the hopes that it would aid in the investigation. The church itself would go on to offer a monetary sum of $1,000 as a reward for any information that would lead to the whereabouts of the sisters. However, this may have been more of a hindrance to the investigation than a boon. The combined effort resulted in 300,000 people being investigated, questioned, and an estimated 2,000 people receiving a more thorough investigation and being more strenuously looked into. However, even with all these efforts, only 2 arrests would occur. However, from this, all charges would drop. This was in part due to the blatant coercion that took part in a protracted interrogation occurring potentially due to the pressure and resources being diverted into the case. This was found after Edward Bedwell asserted that he had been unlawfully coerced into giving a false confession, but all the efforts might not have been in vain. Police efforts and extensive media appeals ended up producing many reported sightings, which, while resulting in dead ends, resulted in several sightings in Brighton Theater on December 28th, and assist authorities at generating a general timeline of the case and finding new suspects. At least one of these sightings involved the girls interacting with and eventually being picked up by a man who strongly resembled Elvis Presley. The man's vehicle was identified as a Mercury model. This would cause several investigators to take this as as evidence that the sisters had either run away from home or were hiding out with a previously unknown boyfriend or boyfriends, causing the case to be delayed from being taken as a more serious missing persons case, even though it had become front page news by December 31st. It would not be until a week later, when the family had received no information about the girls, that the investigation would start to move forward. Frustratingly enough, the media remained laser focused on the belief that the girls had voluntarily run away. It was a point that the appeals were concluded to pleading that the sisters return home, and for any eyewitness to contact the police. This caused numerous new alleged sightings to come forth and pour into the police as late as January 9th. These reports often described one or both of the girls as having been seen appearing in or making visits to various businesses and establishments in a variety of locales. These sightings validated the views held by many investigators that the girls had run away or opted to leave their home out of their own volition. Theories surrounding the case ran amok. Some of these included that the sisters possibly traveled to Nashville with the intent to see Presley live in concert. Another very popular theory was that the girls, who were Presley superfans, had simply decided to leave home and attempt to emulate Elvis Presley. However, with the belief that her daughters had been kidnapped, Loretta Grimes pleaded with the public in statements quoted such as this: "If someone is holding them, please let the girls call me," further stating, "I'll forgive them from the bottom of my heart." On January 19th, 1957, an official statement was issued from the Presley Graceland estate. The statement is as follows: "If you are good Presley fans, you'll go home and ease your mother's worries," operating on the notion that the girls had left of their own volition. Presley eventually also made a direct radio plea himself to the Grimes sisters, imploring that they return home to their mother. Between the last confirmed sighting of the sisters at Brighton Theater on December 28th, 1956, and subsequent discovery of their body 25 days later, several unconfirmed sightings occurred both within and without Chicago. Some of the most widely known examples are as follows. Individuals contacted investigators informing them they had seen the girls boarding a Chicago Transit Authority bus on Archer Avenue heading east into the city. The sisters were allegedly on Western Avenue, approximately halfway between the theater and their home at approximately 11:05 p.m. Another of their leads would come from Roger Maynard, who informed the investigators he had also attended the December 28th screening of Love Me Tender, having a seat behind Barbara and Patricia, along with being seated rather close to Weinert. According to Maynard, he had left the theater approximately 1 minute before the sisters, and had apparently walked down Archer Avenue, and that the sisters had walked a short distance behind him before a late model green Buick had stopped alongside them. He stated that the girls hesitated sighting the car before they continued walking. It was just past 42nd Street that the sisters were now walking ahead of him, that a black 1949 Mercury occupied by two teenage boys pulled up alongside the girls. However, rather than the incident leading to anything, they simply giggled before continuing walking in the direction of their home. Yet another incident involving two teenage boys, named Ed Lorden and Earl Destro, who spoke to investigators, telling them that while they had been driving through McKinley Park at approximately 11:30 p.m. on December 28th, had seen the sisters on 35th Street. Supposedly, the two had been giggling and jumping out of doorways at each other near Seeley and Damon Avenues, causing one of the two drivers to know, "Those two are the Grimes sisters, right?" as they passed them. At this point, the girls would have been approximately 2 blocks from their home. There is also the security guard by the name of Jack Franklin, who would later inform investigators that he had offered directions to two girls on the morning of December 29th, approximately 12 hours after they had left the theater. This verbal exchange had allegedly occurred near Lawrence and Central Park Avenues, and Franklin later concluded that the girls had been the Grimes sisters, adding that the sole reason he had recalled this conversation was due to both of the girls having been rude and abrupt to him. On the same date of Franklin's alleged sighting of Barbara and Patricia, a friend of Barbara's named Judy Burrow reported to investigators that she had seen the sisters at approximately 2:30 p.m. walking westward on Archer Avenue, 2 blocks from Damon Avenue. Another sighting was that of Catherine Borks, a classmate of Patricia, who had been adamant that she had seen Patricia walking past a restaurant Bork had been in on December 29th. According to Bork, Patricia had been in the company of 2 unidentified young girls. This sighting was followed by another 6 hours later by a cashier at the Clark Theater in downtown Chicago who claimed he had seen both girls at 12:45 a.m. A railroad conductor by the name of Bernard Norton reported seeing two girls aboard a train near the Great Lakes Naval Training Center in north suburban Glenview. According to the conductor, the two girls were looking for sailors by the names of Terry and Larry. On December 30 at 5:40 a.m., the owner of D&L Restaurant at 1340 West Madison said that he had seen both girls, with Patricia apparently too drunk or sick to walk without staggering, also stating that she was accompanied by suspect Edward Bedwell. The location of the sighting had been over 5.5 miles from the theater the girls had left. There was also a clerk at the Claremont Hotel who, after viewing the bodies at the mortuary, likewise identified the sisters as having checked into the hotel on this date. The following week, a night clerk at Unity Hotel on West 61st Street refused two girls a room because of their age. The clerk believed the girls in question to have been the Grimes sisters. On January 17th, a woman named Pearl Neville contacted investigators to state that she had met both girls in Nashville in a restroom on January 9th, and that she had accompanied them to a state employment agency to search for work. According to Neville, both girls had been in what she described as being a tired, bed-ragged condition. A clerk at the agency would later identify the sisters from photographs, also recording that both girls had used the surname Grimes in their application forms that they had been given and returned. In the early hours of January 14th, parents of a classmate of Patricia Grimes named Sandra Tolson were said to have received two anonymous phone calls. During the first call, the other end of the phone was deadly quiet. The second call was picked up about 14 minutes afterwards. Sandra's mother, Anne, had heard a frightened and desperate young female voice ask, "Is that you, Sandra? Is Sandra there?" But before Anne could bring her daughter, the call was terminated. Miss Tolson informed the investigators of her conviction that the caller had been Patricia Grimes. During the following thaw and rain, which further removed the coating of ice and snow from the area on January 22nd, 1957, Leonard Prescott found the naked bodies of the Grimes sisters behind a guardrail off German Church Road. He at the time was uncertain as to what he had found. He thought that it had been the bodies of mannequins or dolls. Prescott would later return to the site with his wife Mary, who upon closer inspection of what her husband had found would faint. There were two frozen bodies, the bodies of the Grimes sisters, right there, which had been stripped of any form of clothing or covering and unceremoniously left at the site. The Prescotts immediately reported their findings to the Willow Springs Police Department. The bodies of the two girls had been left lying on the snow-covered ground directly behind the guardrail. Barbara was laid on her left side. Her legs had been drawn slightly up towards her torso. In contrast, her sister Patricia was laying on her back with her body obstructing the view of her sister's head, and her head had been twisted to the right. There were 3 wounds resembling those which were commonly found to be inflicted by ice picks, discovered across Barbara's chest, while numerous injuries of varying degrees resembling bruises had been discovered upon Patricia's face and body. The girl's father, Joseph Grimes, would soon after the initial finding be escorted to the discovery site to formally identify the bodies. Following Joseph's initial positive identification of the bodies, over 160 police officers from several surrounding precincts and departments would conduct a search of the crime scene. This search uncovered little to no actionable evidence or leads from the crime scene proper. The search itself was later criticized due to the organizing, including untrained individuals who wound up trampling over any potential evidence. The autopsies were performed the following day. These autopsies would be performed by forensic pathologists, who, following a 5-hour examination of each body, were unable to reach an agreement on either a date or the cause of death. These experts, however, would eventually settle that by examining the contents of the girls' stomachs, both girls had most likely died approximately 5 hours of the time they had last been seen alive, the night of the movie, thus fixing a likely time of death in each instance having been either late evening December 28th or early morning December 29th. The cause of death in each case was ruled as being a combination of shock and exposure. It was concluded that many of the wounds discovered upon the girls' bodies had most likely been inflicted by rodents, with the actual puncture wounds having most likely been caused well after death. One of the coroners to perform the autopsies was Walter McCorn, who stated that the sisters' bodies had lain undiscovered beneath the guardrail on German Church Road for many days before their eventual discovery, stating that the bodies were remarkably preserved due to being in frigid temperatures the week prior to January 22nd, adding that had been due to the recent snowfall and remarkably frigid temperature. Macron also concluded that the girls' bodies had lain undiscovered for more than 3 weeks because of the layers of snow had blanketed the area on January 9th, and that this snowfall had rapidly melted in the days prior to their discovery. Despite the official conclusions, the chief investigator of Cook County Coroner's Office, Harry Goles, disagreed with the official time of death, later stating to the media that there had been numerous marks of violence on those girls' faces which were strongly indicative of their being recipients of violence, as opposed to them being post-mortem rodent infestation as the causes of the injuries. Gloss also contended that the thin layer of ice found encrusted upon the sisters' bodies indicated that they had most likely been alive until at least January 7th, since only after that date would there have been sufficient snowfall to react to the girls' natural body temperature in such a climate that would create a thin layer of ice that was discovered upon their exposed bodies. Gloss believed that this proved that their bodies had been warm when they had been deposited beside German Church Road. In addition to these facts, he stated that the girls had been subjected to sexual assault through the period of their captivity, adding that their autopsy conducted on Patricia had discovered semen within her vaginal fluids, along with vehemently stating that the curdled milk had also been found within Barbara's stomach, which she was known not to have drank before or during her trip to the cinema on December 28th. Toxicology reports also revealed that the girls had not been drunk or drugged or poisoned prior to their deaths. Further still, no items of the sisters' clothing were ever found. Although their bodies were described by the pathologists as having been remarkably clean, the autopsies would also show that Barbara had also been likely engaged in sexual intercourse around the time of her death, although no evidence pointed towards it being forced or molestation. The official death certificates of Barbara and Patricia list the causes of death as murder, specifically secondary shock, resulting from exposure to low temperatures which reduced the girls' body temperatures below critical levels compatible with life. Following a wake held in the girls' memory on January 25th, Barbara and Patricia Grimes were laid to rest at the Holy Sepulchre Cemetery in Alsip, Illinois on January 28th. All fees for the service were waived by the funeral home, and the sisters were buried side by side. Amongst those to serve as pallbearers were some of Barbara's classmates. On May 1957, Loretta Grimes received an anonymous telephone call from an individual who claimed to have undressed and killed her daughters. However, the Grimes family had received numerous hoax phone calls following the girls' disappearance. This particular caller, however, went so far as to mock police efforts and their laying of blame on suspects such as Edward Bedwell. He ended his phone call with the information indicating that he may indeed have been the perpetrator by stating, "I know something about your little girl that no one else knows, not even the police. The smallest girl's toes were crossed at her feet." The caller then laughed before terminating the phone call. The deformity on her daughter's feet, which had never been released, had been perfectly detailed to her. She would go on to state, "I will never forget that voice." 1 year later, after the murder of the daughters, Loretta Grimes publicly stated that her conviction that her daughters had been murdered by an individual they had known, stating that although the weather had been bitterly cold on the night of their disappearance, Barbara and Patricia would never have entered the vehicle driven by an unknown individual, regardless of any discomfort. Joseph lawman, the Cook County Sheriff, strongly believed that the Grimes sisters had been beaten, tortured, and murdered by a sexual predator who had lured them into the vehicle on the evening of their disappearance. The 18th anniversary of the disappearances, Ernest Spiato, a detective who had been involved in the investigation of the girls' murder from the very beginning and had remained assigned to the investigation, again announced that the media and police had no credible suspects in the case. James Grimes, who was just 11 at the time of his sister's murder, stated in 2013 that he welcomed what he saw in the public as a reopening of the case, going on to state, "I just assumed it was never going to be solved. Maybe there's hope." In 2013, a retired West Chicago police officer named Raymond Johnson began a personal investigation into the case. Johnson had become interested in the Grimes sisters' case in 2010 when he had been researching a book he had been writing about the city's history. Having researched the case, Johnson has stated that the case is still solvable. However, it would be possible only with the assistance of the public. He believed that the perpetrator of the crime had been a 23-year-old self-confessed child killer named Charles Leroy Milquist, who had been considered a suspect in the sisters' abduction and murder case in 1957. Charles had been convicted of the September 1958 murder of a 15-year-old girl named Bonnie Leigh Scott, whom he had previously known prior to her murder, and whose decapitated body had been found 2 months after her disappearance, less than 10 miles from the dump site of the Grimes sisters. Following the discovery of the body, investigators noted the similarities in the murders and the disposal sites. However, he was never questioned about any potential connection to the Grimes sisters' murders, as his attorney had forbidden him from subsequent questioning. Moving on to the suspects in the case, we start with Edward Bedwell. Edward Lee Bedwell was a 21-year-old semi-literate drifter, originally from Tennessee, who had been evicted from his family home in East Garfield Park on November 1956, and who had, in the weeks preceding the Grimes sisters' murder, occasionally earned money by working part-time as a dishwasher in a Chicago restaurant. Bedwell was a rather tall individual who allegedly bore a striking resemblance to Elvis Presley. According to the owners of the restaurant where Bedwell had been employed, he and another young male had been at the premises in the company of two girls who physically resembled the Grimes sisters in the early morning of December 30th. The authorities were granted this tidbit of information on January 24th. Bedwell was arrested shortly thereafter and subjected to a harsh interrogation and questioning for 3 days. Initially, Bedwell was insistent that John Minnie Duros, along with a patron who had identified him, were mistaken in their identification of the girls. He would be formally charged with the sisters' murder on January 27th, 1957, having signed a 14-page confession in which he said that 28-year-old acquaintance of his named William Cole had been in the company of the Grimes sisters on December 30th. He stated that they were together until January 7th, drinking in various West Madison Street saloons. According to the statements Bedwell signed, after several days in the girls' willing company, he and his companion fed the sisters hot dog, and they had extensively beaten both girls, throwing their nude bodies in the snow. Bedwell's confession caused Loretta Grimes to quote, "It's a lie. My girls wouldn't be on West Madison Street. They didn't even know where it was." William admitted that he had been in the company of Bedwell and two girls in the early hours of December 30th, but he denied the girls had been the Grimes sisters. He also emphatically denied any involvement in the murders. Bedwell himself would later recant his confessions, as he had been coerced by the investigators, stating that he had only confessed after being held in custody for days, along with being mistakenly led by police to believe that he would be let off if he said what they wanted to hear. The autopsy reports upon both girls also supported Bedwell's recantation, as there was no alcohol or hot dogs found in either of the victims' bodies or digestive tract, nor had the girls been beaten to death. Further complicating the detective's case was that Bedwell had been clocked in at Ajax Consolidated Company from 4:19 p.m. on December 28, 1956 to 12:30 a.m. on December December 29th, covering the most likely time that the sisters had been abducted. Further records confirmed that Bedwell had been working in Cicero on the date that he said he had murdered them. On February 6th, Bedwell was freed on a $20,000 bond, paid for by another individual. The same year, he was acquitted. Bedwell would be tried and acquitted once more of the 1956 rape of a 13-year-old girl in Oak Hill, Florida. The next suspect is Max Fielg. Max Fielg was a 17-year-old suspect in the sisters' murder, initially considered one of the prime suspects due to his age. Fielg was protected by the contemporary Illinois laws that prevented juveniles being subjected to polygraph tests. Nevertheless, the Chicago police captain at the time persuaded the teenager to submit to an unofficial polygraph test. In the course of this unofficial polygraph test, Fielg allegedly confessed to the murders. With no leads or means of using the test as evidence against Fielg, police were forced to release him without charges. In addition, the police were unable to charge Fielg with the murders due to the lack of any physical evidence corroborating the confession, which he had kidnapped the girls and supposedly killed them. He would later be jailed for the unrelated murder of a young woman. The last of the three suspects I will be covering is Walter Kranz, a 53-year-old self-proclaimed psychic who phoned into a switchboard at Chicago Central Police complaint room on January 15th to inform the operator that both sisters had been deceased and that their bodies would be found in an unincorporated area of Lionel's Township. Kranz refused to disclose his name to the operator in his phone call, simply stating that he had experienced a revelation in a dream before terminating the call. Nonetheless, the operator was able to trace the call back to the location, which was his home. The park he had described was shown to be around 1 mile from the location where the girls' bodies would be eventually found. The call occurred just 1 week prior to them being found. When questioned, Kranz informed the police that he and several members of his family and ancestors possessed psychic abilities, and that he had experienced a particular vision after a night of heavy drinking. Initially, he was considered to be a prime suspect in the murders, with initial handwriting experts also determining that he may have written a ransom note received by the girl's mother prior to the discovery of their daughter's bodies. Kranz denied any involvement in the sisters' abduction and murder, and after being subjected to multiple interrogations, he was released. Unfortunately, despite the vast resources and heavy scrutiny, the case still remains unsolved. Answers of who took the lives of the girls and why did they do it still remain unanswered. If you remained with me until the end, I thank you, and I do hope you stay tuned and subscribe for more content.